My name is Natalie Carroll, and the title of my project is Red Scare and Black Freedom Struggle: The Effect of Communist Propaganda on the Civil Rights Movement and the Decolonization of Africa. This is a political history examining the motivations of state and national leaders and how Cold War policies impacted people on the ground. It also engages with diplomatic history by studying the connections between nations. I want to start with a quote from Malcolm X. He said, "There is no system more corrupt than a system that represents itself as the example of freedom, the example of democracy, when you have citizens of this country who have to use bullets if they want to cast ballots." Malcolm X argued on April 8, 1964, that the United States was hypocritical for calling itself the leader of the free world and advocating for democracy when African Americans at home were living under Jim Crow. In the midst of the Cold War, he brought to attention the international landscape of minorities being oppressed by American imperialism. By doing this, he made a connection between the domestic civil rights movement and the fight for independence overseas. Moreover, the international context of the Cold War brought light to racial inequality in America as well. And that brings me to my thesis. While the United States advocated for freedom under democracy, its government did nothing to achieve racial equality until Soviet propaganda pointed out that African Americans were living under a white supremacist regime. By doing this, the Soviet Union was able to influence the politics of newly independent nations in Africa and Asia. The beginnings of the civil rights movement predate the Brown versus Board of Education ruling of 1954. The memory of the civil rights movement is structured around major events that begin with Brown and end with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in 1968. This timeline is referred to as the classical version of what is actually years longer. The longer timeline is referred to simply as the long civil rights movement, and this theory's timeline starts in the 1930s and continues even to this day. Some believe that the Double V campaign, a slogan describing the fight against fascism overseas and the battle for racial equality at home during the 1940s, is the beginning of the civil rights movement. However, as previously mentioned, the movement started before this. The term long civil rights movement was coined by Jacqueline Dodehall in her article, The Long Civil Rights Movement and the Political Uses of the Past. Within the first few pages, she paints an image that the civil rights movement is remembered by: Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivering his "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963 at the March on Washington. What is not remembered are the efforts of civil rights activists during the 1930s and 1940s. Activists such as Ella Baker, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and James Farmer served as major influential figures in the wake of the classical civil rights movement. Dodehall describes her analysis of the long civil rights movement as a movement that took root in the liberal and radical milieu of the late 1930s, was intimately tied to the rise and fall of the New Deal order, accelerated during World War II, stretched far beyond the South, was continuously and ferociously contested, and in the 1960s and 1970s inspired a movement that defied any narrative of collapse. Why are the beginnings of the civil rights movement tied to communism? There are two reasons for this. First, the beginnings of the civil rights movement and the beginnings of the Cold War completely overlap. The timelines of these events are reflective of each other. In other words, the events of the civil rights movement and the Cold War are intertwined. Second, the resistance that confronted the civil rights movement adamantly declared that the civil rights activists were communists. Segregationists claimed that integration in any aspect of American society was not natural and therefore un-American. The only thing more un-American than racial equality was communism, and this ideology actually advocated for racial equality. To white America, the connection was clear. If you were in favor of equality of the races, you were also a communist. Pro-communist propaganda positively influenced the civil rights movement because it enforced the idea that communism supported the fight for racial equality and that American democracy and capitalism did not. As a result, the United States was forced to address its racial injustices. This is the first of 3 examples of pro-communist propaganda that I will show. This poster says, "Higher the banner of proletarian internationalism." As you can see, this poster is advocating for racial equality. The date is 1958. This is a Chinese poster advocating for racial equality. It says, "Oppose racial discrimination." Another poster titled "The Shame of America" depicts a black man lying in a pool of blood with a cityscape in the background. The propaganda poster is dated 1968. This is a reference to the summer of 1967 that was filled with deadly race riots. In the wake of the Cold War, newly independent nations such as Ghana, Algeria, Republic of the Congo, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were faced with a new challenge, deciding what kind of government they would want. America aimed for these nations to adopt a democratic form of government, while the Soviet Union hoped to persuade them to adopt communism. Martin Luther King Jr. attended the independence festivities in Ghana in 1957. While he was there, King spoke with Vice President Richard Nixon and told him, "I want you to come visit us down in Alabama, where we are seeking the same kind of freedom that Ghana is celebrating." This statement weighed heavily, considering representatives of the American government were doing more to change the rest of the world's perception of the civil rights movement than to actually address the racial strife at home. King's presence at Ghana's independence celebration underlines the importance of the decolonization of Africa for the civil rights movement in the United States. The pro-communist propaganda shown in previous slides helped to sway newly independent nations to become communist because the propaganda pointed out that under democracy in America, not everyone was treated equally. And to tie things up, I just want to conclude with my thesis. While the United States advocated for freedom under democracy, its government did nothing to achieve racial equality until pro-communist propaganda pointed out that African Americans were living under a white supremacist regime. By doing this, the Soviet Union was able to influence the politics of newly independent nations in Africa and Asia.